I guess I'm going to start with a little bit of a caveat. I spent my time here feeling a little bit like an imposter or a fraud because my link to Athens, to the BSA, to the academic disciplines of classical studies or archaeology are tenuous at best. They kind of melt away when I try to touch them. The idea of coming here was first formed through an attraction, like many, to the idea of the away, of sun, of time, and of the time and space of it all. And then came the pleasure of performing the time travel of archive research in order to think through the application of the colonial imagination in a kind of similar time but distinct space to my research inquiries into colonial West Africa. And finally, whilst actually being here, with the exploration of the ways in which disciplines talk in different ways. There is a gulf in language, in modes of being and knowing, so that we both feel at once exotic and of course misunderstood. This reminded and reaffirmed to me that my research, my time here, lies in the butting up of knowledges, a messy, fraught and problematized coexistence that can occur when trying to reinforce a lack of hierarchies with knowledge. If I can borrow from Donna Haraway, it is the experience and ethic of always sitting with the trouble. So I'm going to use this opportunity of this talk to share snatches of my experience here with you and also the methodology that roots my artistic practice and historical and theoretical research of my PhD project, because the two go hand in hand and alongside. Scenes from the BSA archive. I clearly love documents. The thought occurred to me as I climbed the stairs and turned the corner, trying to be quiet, unnoticed, to do as I was supposed to, and to not disturb. I remember hearing someone say that once. They were trying to justify, answer the why in why do you work with archives, even though. Why, despite limitations, she still persisted, still went into rooms where sheets of paper are valorized, where the feeling of potential censure looms large as you put on a pair of white gloves. Why she still tried to eke out a taste, a touch, a feeling, a morsel of what had gone before, from a scratched scrawl on a page that explains that this was written in bed when the author wasn't feeling quite right. I've sat here before, reading the same things in another place and at a different time. I think about what it means for me to read this, to air it out into the presence atmosphere, give it time and give it space. That thought and boredom forced my eyes further down the page, reading about how the ship smelt, how he spent his time, and what he thought of this new place. I want to be done, but something might be here, something I didn't know before, something I could learn, a discovery. The thing that can calcify an argument. I feel like I increasingly use the archive to prove myself right. I curate what I share, so you don't see all the complications, all the ditherings, equivocations, all the not quite rights. The urge for posterity is strange to me. To cast yourself into the future and think that the conversations you've had, quotidian activities described in acute detail, or ideas that have occurred to you are worth saving is particular. You learn it, well, some of us do. When I was 14, I thought I should write a pamphlet, a missive, or a manifesto, because that's what I had learned is what you do when you had ideas. Those pages sit in my mother's trunk, preserved in the plastic sheets in a yellow folder that has my name on it. The trunk has always kept the past. I used to open it up and play with it and find another version of my mother. I think she keeps things in it for the book that she always told me that I should write, her biography. I wonder what it would be like for someone to read my precocious adolescence, what event would have to take place for it to be elevated as something to be learned from. For someone to touch the paper I wrote on and run their fingers over the dried biro ink as they grow bored of my musings and they begin to imagine. I clearly love documents. That feels too simple a thing to admit. It can't be just that. So, my PhD research project explores the ways in which archives are representative of a system of thought that's intimately bound up in the British colonial project. so that the archival objects reproduce particular ways of knowing people, places, cultures, things, and ways of being. Colonial here is not simply the formal extractive relationship between Great Britain and the colonies during the British Empire, but instead I refer to colonial thought, a framework and the dominant way of knowing that is privileged in the Western world. The way in which we come to know and understand the world is through the application of reason applied to visual evidence, a positivist Enlightenment framework. As an artist that works primarily with moving image, I was interested to explore these ideas in relation to early cinema. Early cinema and colonialism are in some ways bound together. Cinema allowed for a distant looking. The audience could be transported to the natural habitats of the colonized, but protected by the long-range vision of the camera mounted far in the distance, peering on, just like they would at the world fairs. The people in the films were to be seen as specimens of race and culture rather than as individuals. So cinema became a necessary evidencing tool of a nascent science of anthropology and ethnography. Seeing was believing, and the images in early film confirmed the knowledge that was being perpetuated by elites in the academies, newspapers, and salons of the West. There is a focus of what is seen in front of the lens rather than who is doing the seeing. Colonial image making seeks to tell us of the colonized. However, it tells us of the colonizers, meaning that, quote, early films of native people become legible as documents of colonialism, not of documents of native people. So in this kind of moment in the ether of like how anthropology and early cinema and ethnography emerged, it was in the conditions that were shaped by colonialist and nationalist imaginings. And this is from some documents from kind of like the establishment of the British School here. And there is this idea that one of the things that was the impetus behind creating the British School was that there was a French school, there was the American school, and it was necessary for Britain to keep its place. So there's this kind of like nationalist underpinnings to this kind of a project. So, my research is focused primarily on film material and documents produced during the operation of the Colonial Film Unit from 1932 to 1955. So the Colonial Film Unit was part of the Ministry of Information, and I use these particular dates to kind of classify the material because it's the explicit enunciation by the British state of film as a, quote, device for colonial administration. So these film units made films for and about all of the British colonies. And there were a few self-directed units. So that meant units in which people from those colonies actually worked on the films. Usually the filmmakers came from Britain and went and spent a short amount of time in the places that they made the films on. But in India, in Ghana, and in Nigeria, there were self-directed units. So my research both examines archives as institutions, the space, the layout, the administration, governance, and structure, and also analyses archives as sources of knowledge production, thinking through the politics of the process that allows an object to become archival material. So in this research, in viewing all of this material, in watching all of the films and looking at all the papers, an ethical question kind of emerged for me. If I think that the archive is in some way locked into a perpetuation of a colonial way of knowing, the people, cultures, places, and things that it contains, how can this be combated? And in trying to contend with this problem, I developed a methodological approach called critical proximity, which I have been using in the practice that I've been making for my PhD. So I use the term critical proximity. It's kind of borrowed by a French theorist called Bruno Latour, who uses it in an imagined conversation with Donna Haraway. And the conversation is about her ideas on situated knowledge, which she, the idea behind it is that it's a feminist objectivity. It's a reflective approach to knowledge production. So I've kind of occupied the term to nod to the concept of critical distance that's championed by Western positivist empiricism. So the critical in critical proximity attempts to raise historically illegitimized ways of knowing to sit alongside the kind of dominant knowledge frameworks in the same value chain. So elevating them, valorizing them in the way that an archive valorizes the knowledge that it contains. So that critical proximity exists not necessarily in opposition to the methods of colonial thought, but alongside, occupying the liminal space of the many methods of coming to know. So critical proximity is saturated by a multiplicity of knowledge frameworks. There's not one way of knowing, so there's not one way of coming to that. And so I talked a little bit about illegitimate ways of knowing. So those are the ones that aren't traditionally valued as like the proper ways of understanding. Avery Gordon describes this as, quote, subjugated, marginalized, and discredited knowledge from below and from outside the institutions of official knowledge production. These could be knowledges of gesture, of astrology, of dance, or of the fictive. So the kind of proximity part of critical proximity refers to the relationship that I, as a researcher, have with the archive. Instead of simply looking at the material from a discerning distance, I position myself as close to its contents in an attempt to try and create an intimate relationship with those in which have been contained and marginalized by the archive. I kind of use the theorizations of presence to think about this. So Gail Lewis defines presence as, quote, presence, or in fact the verb presencing, as an epistemological and ontological praxis of emergence based on felt connection among human and non-human, ancestral and contemporary life. It contests and has the potential to detoxify the effects of colonial discourse, historical and contemporary, in which indigenous peoples are rendered invisible and or insensible, end quote. So in the encounter at the archive, illegitimate ways of knowing can be activated. A number of instincts, desires, feelings, or senses can be provoked by the material. For critical proximity, it's important to be open to all the ways in which the archive can, as Foucault describes, stir more fibers in me, its intensities, and your own vibrations to it. In practice, this meant taking critical proximity into the archives. So visiting archives and tracing my experiences there. I've used collections previously housed at the British Film Institute, the Bristol Record Office, the National Archives in Kew, the Bodleian, and the Pitt Rivers Museum at Cambridge. And in tracing my experience at these places, I try not to shut anything down and allow my mind to wander wherever, because an important part of my methodology is making use of the ways of knowing that we may have been socialized to dismiss or discourage. I often write narrative, diaristic prose to accompany these experiences, like the one that I read about the BSA at the start. And here's another example. Scenes from the National Archive. Sitting there at the octagonal tables of the National Archive reading room, I got a thrill at the musty smell of the pages. I again looked around the room for anyone to censure me as I slowly raised my face to the pages to deeply inhale the smell. It's awful. Not a pleasant one, and I usually don't seek out displeasure, but I liked this. I traced my fingers along the pages, following the cursive of 1920s colonial zeal. It's almost impossible to read what they wrote. I strained and strained. One of the archivists that led the introduction to the National Archive this morning explained paleography to me, that for pre-modern texts it was necessary for researchers to be literate in handwriting styles. I stupidly hadn't conceived of not being able to read written English, or that this kind of literacy was contingent on the particular place, space, and time you found yourself in. I kind of laughed at that naivety. I was looking for my own name in the lists of people that had testified at the ABBA Women's War Commission of Inquiry. There were scores of pages of names, but I knew I would find it. Despite never meeting anyone as a child that shared my name, and people always saying how unique and beautiful it was in place of what they really meant, that it was unusual, I knew my name was common somewhere else. My name got stuck in people's mouths, held there by unfamiliarity and fear. If my mind wandered off during the register at primary school and I forgot my place, the sharp intake of breath alerted me to the fact that it was my turn. So I turned the pages of the report and laboriously wrote down the names, fully unable to actually pronounce them, knowing that I would need to go back to my mother and have her repeat them syllable by syllable clearly into my dictaphone so I could play the names to myself before I went to sleep, a bit like how I tried to pass my French oral exam in year 11. So put simply, critical proximity is about being here, in the archive, open to other ways of knowing and using that presence as a point of departure in making moving image works that speak to the ethical dilemma of reusing the colonial archive. So I'm going to show an example, it's a short film, it's like a 7-minute film, of one of the works that I created using this methodology as part of my research. It's called Specialized Technique, and it refers to the techniques that the Colonial Film Unit directors were encouraged to use when making films about people in West Africa. And because of an incident that happened at the start of the Colonial Film Unit, when William Sellers showed a film to some people in a village in Nigeria, and it had a zoomed-in image of a mosquito. And at the end of showing this film, he asked them how they found it, and everyone was like, we're really lucky that we don't have giant mosquitoes here. And so he decided, because they weren't obviously cine literate, because cinema was a new thing across the world, but he decided that because of this, it meant actually that they weren't able to look at images in the same way that European people were. And actually he thought that the eyes of people in West Africa worked differently than they did. And this kind of idea wasn't disabused until the 50s, at the end of the Colonial Film Unit, when an anthropologist came to that part of West Africa and was like, no, actually, it's all the same. So he developed this technique which involved no camera trickery. So there was no movement, there was no zooming, everything was very static. And so I was interested in kind of uprooting this kind of idea and thinking about ways in which to use some of the material that he created against his intentions. So as part of the methodology of critical proximity, I focus on the kind of illegitimate knowledge of dance and gesture and my experiences of using the archive that this film references at the British Film Institute and at the British National Archives influence the form and content of the work.
Pulse, 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 hold and pause.
Okay, so that was a film that was part of a series of three works that were all looking to use critical proximity in reference to my research in the archives of a particular event that was the ABBA Women's War of 1929. So I was thinking through how to use, as I said, illegitimate or other ways of knowing to kind of communicate what I learned or what I understood or what the archive told me about that particular event. So yeah, an example of the methodology. So I kind of come to now, what has critical proximity looked like in Athens? So for me, in many ways, I was interested in coming here because I was interested in being in another archive and experiencing what the kind of regimes and the administration and the somewhat universality of archives that are rooted in a particular framework of knowledge in colonial thought, as I said before, which is this mainstream dominant way in which we come to know through education and through our daily lives. So I was interested in that experience and writing these kind of diary entries of what I was kind of inspired by. So I was interested in looking at personal papers because I'm working on a project that is employing lots of different narrative devices. So I was looking to kind of mimic the style of the personal papers that people write as part of their research that kind of get left in an attic somewhere and then donated to an institution. Yeah, so I was also interested in mythology because mythology as an illegitimate knowledge, as an illegitimate way of knowing, because there is a way in which we understand our own past or family histories as being complicated and necessary fictions. But this is very often not afforded to our social or cultural histories. Quote, "The work of mythology is to guard against things being forgotten. What is thought to be in, what is false. It deals with what is important." So archivization as a process confers the power of truth onto its contents, so that the archive becomes the way in which we know shared social histories, like the way in which we know the British colonial past and certain places and peoples as former colonies, as frozen in film as those pasts. And there's a process in which the reproduction of those archive material continues that particular knowledge of those places. So in order to demonstrate in my work and argue that there are multiple valid ways to come to knowledge, I'm interested in telling histories in multiple ways and stacking all of those retellings alongside each other without any kind of hierarchy of knowledge, so that they blur and seep into one another. And so that it's hard to see it's hard to see the separation between them. So it can be argued that myths are the inverse of the historical positivist knowledge obtained from archives. Claude Lévi-Strauss says that the myths are history without archives. So whilst at the BSA, I've been working on creating an origin myth of a town in southeastern Nigeria called Arundizog to exist alongside in the same frame as archival depictions of the very same place. So this film tells the same story in 4 different parts. It is a story of the ways in which the slave trade at the end of the 19th century interacted with my grandfather. So one version of this story that the film utilizes is that of the origin myth of that town. The second is the narrative of a researcher on an archive trip that I've been using the kind of personal diaries to model on. This third retelling is that of the chorus, or of the way in which to tell the story through dance and song. And the fourth kind of device and way in which the story is told is as a story that's passed down in snippets and fragments through the family. So this film is a much larger project that I've been working on as I've been here. And I'm gonna share with you the story, the origin myth, or part of it, the beginning of it, that I have created, and the story is called There Were Two Brothers. And I'm just gonna show like a kind of visual story, visual book of it.
There were two brothers, born minutes apart. Their mother hadn't wanted to believe there were two. She had felt them and heard people whispering, but she had made her offerings and thought it would not be so. That when the day came, one would dissolve away. Her senior wife was at the door ready to take both children away, attempting to do what was always done. But the mother had screamed out and caught her hesitation. She had pleaded with them, pleaded for another way. She looked away from her and gave the babies back. No one else in the room spoke. There was only one way. So she traveled that day to Ebinyongbabia. You might know it as the long juju of Arochukwu. She knew she would not return to her husband's place, that her and the Ejime's blood could run through the river and no one would ever know. For the oracle demands a person. You are a person, aren't you? But she still went, walking with both boys tied at her back. She was met by servants of Ebinyongbabia who took her meandering through the bush, through the caves, gully and waterfall to the shrine. That is why it was so named by the British. This juju takes long to find. Eyes averted, she passed the kola nuts that she had fastened to a wrapper onto one of the servants. It was broken, sheared, and she then pled her case. The interlocutor told her that the boys had to leave because they would make their mark, but they had to be separated at the 13th Ikeji after their birth. The gods requested 8 eggs, a bull, a cock, 8 big yams, and 8 small yams before this separation to thank them for their leniency. At first they were to live here, close to the shrine, and so that is what they did. They grew up alongside each other in the shadow of Ebinyongbabia, waiting. They grew up steadily.
Yes, that's just like a little excerpt from the story, the myth that I've written. And I guess to kind of sum up, I think that the whole idea of critical proximity is for these kind of marginalized and illegitimate ways of knowing to exist in spaces like this, to be possible for people to use a lot of different tools to communicate knowledge and come to understand things. And I guess I'm like deeply interested in an interdisciplinary approach to academia and to learning. So I hope there's something in there that you might find interesting for your own research. Thank you.